In his final days, Phil Robertson's health declined rapidly. The beloved patriarch of Duck Dynasty, the man whose beard and Bible became symbols of small-town faith and American grit, passed away at the age of 79. For 11 seasons, from 2012 to 2017, television audiences watched Phil and his family run their duck commander business in Louisiana, turning handmade duck calls into a multi-million-dollar empire. But behind the fame and the fortune was a man whose final act would move his family to tears. Just months after revealing his battle with Alzheimer's disease, Phil's passing sent shockwaves through both his hometown of West Monroe and the millions who had followed his journey. Yet the true emotional moment came not at the funeral, but in the lawyer's office when his family opened his will. According to those present, the reading was intimate. His wife, Kay, sat surrounded by their children, Alan, Jace, Willie, Jep, and daughter Phyllis, each uncertain of what to expect. What they found wasn't just a will. It was a final letter of love and faith from a man who had built his life on both. Each share of Phil's estimated $10 to $15 million fortune came with a handwritten note. These weren't legal documents. They were personal messages. In each, Phil spoke directly to his children about their childhoods, their struggles, and the lessons he hoped they would carry on. Kay, his wife of more than 50 years, inherited full ownership of the family's Louisiana estate and a large fund to care for their grandchildren. Alan, the eldest and a former pastor, received Phil's treasured collection of religious books and the royalties from his writings. Jace and Jep were granted proportional shares of Duck Commander, tasked with continuing the brand's traditional spirit. Phyllis, the daughter Phil only reunited with later in life, was given property and a heartfelt letter of apology, a written symbol of reconciliation. And finally, Willie, who had worked side by side with his father through the height of Duck Dynasty, inherited majority control of the family business. Along with it came a single charge from Phil himself: protect the faith, protect the family, protect the legacy. It wasn't the money that brought the Robertsons to tears that day. It was the realization that even in death, Phil Robertson had found a way to teach them, one last time, about love, forgiveness, and the true meaning of legacy. In the weeks following Phil Robertson's passing, speculation began to swirl about the true scale of the Robertson family fortune. Several media outlets estimated it could exceed $100 million, factoring in trademarks, land, real estate, copyrights, and steady income from Robertson-branded products that continued to sell nationwide. But for the Robertson family, the real value of what Phil left behind couldn't be measured in money. In a special tribute podcast recorded after the funeral, Jace Robertson reflected, "When my father spoke, my brothers and I didn't interrupt." It was a simple statement, one that revealed the deep respect and quiet authority Phil carried in his family. Phil's legacy, his son said, was far more than a legal document. It was the final chapter of a life defined by simplicity, bold honesty, and unwavering love. When the will was read, his family wept, not because of what they had gained, but because it reminded them of what they had lost. To millions of Americans, Phil Robertson was more than a businessman or television personality. He was a cultural figure, a man who spoke his mind, defended his faith, and refused to bend to modern trends. His outspoken beliefs often put him at odds with Hollywood and the mainstream media, but they also made him a hero to many who felt their values were under attack. One of the most controversial moments came in 2013, when Phil gave a candid interview to GQ magazine and expressed his biblical views on homosexuality, calling it an act that goes against God's design. The comments ignited a media firestorm. A&E, the network behind Duck Dynasty, quickly suspended him, triggering widespread outrage. Civil rights groups condemned his words, and calls for boycotts flooded the airwaves. but the pushback from his supporters was even stronger. Millions rallied behind him, using the viral hashtag #IStandWithPhil to defend what they saw as his right to free expression and religious conviction. Within weeks, A&E was forced to reverse its decision. Sales of Duck Commander merchandise soared, transforming a controversy into a national debate over faith and freedom. To some, Phil was a symbol of resistance to cultural change. To others, a reminder that conviction, however divisive, still had a place in American life. A few years after his first wave of controversy, Phil Robertson once again made headlines, this time for comments that stunned even his most loyal followers. In a video conference, he suggested that men should marry young, ideally by the ages of 15 or 16, to preserve what he saw as traditional family roles. The statement quickly ignited public outrage, but Phil didn't flinch. He defended his words, insisting that modern culture was eroding the foundation of the family. If Americans continued to drift away from biblical principles, he warned, society itself would eventually collapse. In the years that followed, Phil remained as outspoken as ever. He was unapologetically pro-life, pro-gun, and openly critical of liberal media, while standing firmly behind Donald Trump's presidential campaigns. During the 2016 and 2020 elections, he attended rallies across the South, addressing crowds with the same unfiltered conviction that had defined his television persona, blunt, fearless, and always ending with his simple creed, God first. When Duck Dynasty came to an end in 2017, Phil didn't fade from the public eye. Instead, he embraced a new platform, podcasting. His show, Unashamed, co-hosted with his son Jace Robertson, became one of the most popular Christian podcasts in America. It was there that Phil continued to speak freely about faith, family, and the state of the modern world, mixing spiritual reflection with sharp social commentary. Many of his final thoughts were recorded there, a lasting digital record of a man who refused to water down his beliefs. There's no denying that Phil Robertson lived exactly as he preached. No compromise, no appeasement, no filters. In a media world dominated by political correctness, he stood apart, a figure both revered and reviled. To some, he was a voice of faith and authenticity. To others, the epitome of bigotry, conservatism, and intolerance. Both views of Phil Robertson, the devoted man of faith and the unapologetic symbol of controversy, are true, depending on where one stands. Yet behind all the noise that surrounded his fame, few would have imagined just how humble his beginnings really were. Long before the cameras, before Duck Dynasty turned him into a household name, there was just one man in the Louisiana swamps. A shotgun in hand, mud on his boots, and a fierce desire to live life on his own terms. From those murky waters, Phil's journey to the peak of fame would begin. Born in 1946, Phil grew up in the harsh realities of post-World War II poverty. His family had little to their name, often surviving on whatever the swamp could provide. He learned to hunt from his father, crafted his own tools, and lived a life that was simple, rugged, and self-reliant. But even in those rough conditions, Phil's talent stood out. His athletic ability earned him a football scholarship to Louisiana Tech University, where he became the starting quarterback just before Terry Bradshaw, who would go on to become an NFL legend. Yet Phil chose a different path. When the time came to consider a professional football career, he turned it down, not out of fear or failure, but because it clashed with hunting season. To him, true freedom meant answering to no one, living by the rhythm of nature, not by contracts or coaches. That decision shocked many, but it would shape the rest of his life. In 1972, he founded Duck Commander, a small company built around handmade duck calls. The products were plain and practical, yet so effective that hunters across the American South quickly took notice. What began as a humble side business grew, piece by piece, into something much larger. And through it all, the Robertsons remained hands-on. His wife, Kay, and their children helped with assembly, packaging, and shipping. Every product touched by family hands. It wasn't a corporation built for profit. It was a way of life, a family working together to survive and preserve the traditions they cherished. For many years, Duck Commander remained a modest, family-run business, a labor of love rather than a major enterprise. That changed when Willie Robertson, Phil's third son, returned home after finishing school. Unlike his father, Willie saw not just a craft, but a brand with untapped potential. He streamlined production, built a stronger image, expanded online sales, and ultimately took the family business from the backwoods of Louisiana to television screens across America. In 2012, the A&E network launched Duck Dynasty, a show originally meant to be a light-hearted glimpse into the lives of a Southern hunting family. But what followed far exceeded anyone's expectations. Audiences were instantly hooked by the Robertsons' raw authenticity, their dry humor, old-fashioned values, and open faith. There were no scripts, no staged arguments, and no Hollywood polish, just a real family living life on their own terms. At a time when reality TV had become overly produced and artificial, Duck Dynasty stood out for its sincerity. The show quickly became a cultural phenomenon, drawing over 11 million viewers per episode at its peak. Duck Commander merchandise vanished from shelves, and the once humble family of duck call makers became millionaires almost overnight. From 2012 to 2017, Phil Robertson's influence reached far beyond television. While Duck Dynasty made him a household name, he also became an author, public speaker, and a voice for millions of Americans who admired his unapologetic faith. His memoir, Happy, 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 became a national bestseller, and his podcast, Unashamed, drew millions of downloads each month, a platform where Phil could speak freely about life, scripture, and the values he refused to compromise. Yet even at the height of his fame, Phil never changed. He didn't move into a mansion or separate himself from his community. He continued to live exactly as he always had, hunting every season, sharing home-cooked meals with his wife Kay and their children, and ending each day reading the Bible before bed. This wasn't an act or a television persona. Anyone who met Phil Robertson could confirm that what viewers saw on screen was the real man, rugged, faithful, and grounded. His journey from a cabin in the Louisiana swamp to the top of reality television was more than a story of success. It was proof that a person who stays true to himself can rise without ever losing his roots. Phil never sought fame. Fame simply found him, through his work, his family, and the way he lived. And when the Duck Dynasty era came to an end, he didn't cling to the spotlight. He quietly stepped back, handing over the reins of the business and the brand to his children, content to live in peace. Even in his later years, his presence could still be felt in every product, every broadcast, and every message his family shared. What kept him grounded through it all wasn't wealth or recognition. It was faith. Before Phil Robertson became the patriarch of Duck Dynasty, the voice of conservative faith, and the symbol of Southern resilience, he was a very different man. His early years were not defined by scripture or discipline, but by chaos, a blur of alcohol, violence, and neglect. By his own admission in interviews and memoirs, Phil lost himself completely during that period. He abandoned his wife and children for days at a time, disappearing into long drinking binges and reckless living. Through it all, one person refused to give up on him, his wife, Kay, whom he married in 1966. While others might have walked away, she stayed. She prayed for him every day, raised their children alone, and held on to the hope that the man she loved would one day return home transformed. That change finally came. One day, Phil walked into a small church in West Monroe angry, lost, and defiant, and walked out a new man. He found faith, was baptized, and from that moment on, never looked back. That conversion became the turning point of his life. His belief in God didn't just save him, it reshaped everything he touched. When Phil built Duck Commander, he didn't see it as just a business. He saw it as an extension of his faith. The company was run not by the pursuit of profit, but by the principles he held sacred: honesty, humility, and service. Every duck call, every television episode, every public appearance reflected the same spiritual foundation. Even at the height of his fame, Phil never wavered. When Duck Dynasty became a national hit, offers poured in from major brands eager to use his image. But Phil refused to attach his name to anything that contradicted his beliefs. He turned down lucrative sponsorships tied to alcohol, gambling, and sexualized advertising, even rejecting a $1 million contract over a single line he felt went against the Bible. For Phil, success meant nothing if it required compromising his faith. He carried that same conviction into his later years through his Unashamed podcast, which he hosted with his sons Jace and Al Robertson. Together, they tackled issues of faith, family, and modern society, speaking with the same candor that made Phil both respected and controversial. The show drew millions of listeners, not because it was polished, but because it was real. Phil spoke without filters, calling out what he saw as the moral decay of modern culture and urging a return to traditional values. Yet, his faith was never cruel or judgmental. When Phil discovered he had an adult daughter, Phyllis, whom he didn't know existed until he was nearly 70, he didn't deny or hide the truth. Instead, he embraced her. He welcomed her into the family, publicly acknowledged her, and built a relationship grounded in grace. In his final years, Phil Robertson slowly stepped away from the public eye, not because he had changed, but because he wanted peace and time with his family. Though diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease months before his death, his spirit remained unshaken. In the last episodes of his Unashamed podcast, his voice was still clear, calm, and full of conviction. Many listeners refused to believe he was ill. He often repeated the same words near the end: "Don't cry when I die, dance, sing, but don't cry." But when he finally passed, his family couldn't hold back their tears. They hadn't just lost a father, they had lost a teacher, a guide, and a man who truly lived by the faith he preached. Phil had risen from a troubled past to become a man of unwavering belief. Every part of his life, his business, his show, his family, revolved around that faith. And in the end, it was that same faith that allowed him to leave this world in peace, without regrets. His funeral was private and simple. No cameras, no celebrities, only loved ones, friends, and neighbors, reading Bible verses and sharing quiet laughter through tears. His children, Alan, Jace, Willie, Jep, and Phyllis, stood united, honoring his wishes and carrying on his message. Willie Robertson now leads Duck Commander and continues to expand the family's work. A&E has already announced a new chapter, Duck Dynasty, The Revival, premiering in June 2025, focusing on the next generation of Robertsons. Though Phil will no longer appear on screen, his presence will linger in every product, every word, every moment that bears his name. His passing marked not just the loss of a man, but the end of a generation, one built on faith, family, and the belief that a simple life, lived with conviction, could still change the world.